Hey, welcome to Lab, the podcast. Excited to share some time today with director Stephen Gray. Stephen's a multidisciplinary filmmaker based out of Winnipeg, Canada, and his latest documentary, After Death, releases in theaters October 27th across Canada and the United States. The film explores one of life's biggest mysteries, what happens when we die. And he does it with New York Times bestselling authors, doctors, scientists, and survivors. Stephen's work's been featured in commercials and short films, and he's currently working on a documentary series with Amazon Studios. So, Stephen, thank you so much for taking time to be with us, and congrats on the film.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's got to be exciting just weeks out, getting ready for the release of something. You've done other projects and been involved in other projects before. How does this feel different in the weeks leading up to release? Are you feeling something different as this one's getting ready to come out?
Oh, 100%. I mean, this is unlike anything I've done before. So most of my work has been in the commercial space. I've done short documentaries as well. So this is actually my first feature-length film, which is pretty exciting that it goes to this wide of a release.
Yeah, that's got to be crazy. I was looking at places that it would be showing and just the excitement around that. Where are you going to watch it? Where is going to be debut night for you?
So we're gonna first debut it at a premiere in Utah with Angel Studios, and then we're gonna
Okay.
do an LA premiere October 24th, and then I'm flying to Seattle and I'm watching it with our producer on the opening day, 27th, which would be really exciting to kind of with our families and just kind of celebrate together. And flying back to Winnipeg. Hopefully, I kind of catch it a couple times here, just because I don't know something pretty special about that the film is playing in my home city. So
Yeah. Yeah, what an exciting thing. Well, congratulations. And I think it's cool that your first project, I mean, you're touching an issue that and a conversation that I think is obviously relevant to everybody, but there's
right,
something about right now. I think people are asking a question. There's an openness and exploring happening right now that's really, really
yeah.
cool that you're ahead of it and have been working on it. So we'll get into that. But before we talk about the film, I just want to hear how you found your way to making film, and at what point did you discern like there's a calling that I need to lean into? There's something that I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to say no to some things and make this my aim. When did you first discern that that was going to be the route?
Yeah. So I've been a filmmaker for about roughly 15 years or so now. But like I said earlier, mostly in the commercial space. So I have a film production company here that does a lot of kind of Canadian commercials. Most of my work has been working with a company called Leisure Travel Vans, which is a really cool kind of like a luxury kind of RV, and working with that team and just kind of about commercials for the product and that kind of stuff. But yeah, basically what happened was my life got really kind of shaken up, which caused me to kind of ask questions that led me on the path to creating this film. So 2012, my brother-in-law was actually killed by a drunk driver. And for me and my wife, it was really difficult. So I grew up as a Christian, going to church all my life, and read the Bible, and the Bible talks about, heaven. And I always had that hope and that faith, but all of a sudden it's just like it's really being put to the test. And to be honest with you, I was asking questions that, really kind of, um, yeah, it just kind of shook up my faith quite a bit. So I
Yeah.
wasn't sure, to be honest with you, if there really was a heaven, if these are just kind of hopeful, thoughts, and these are just kind of stories that were told. And so I was just kind of searching for something more. Yeah, it's really hard to kind of go through that grief. It's like when grief comes to your door in that way. Losing my brother-in-law, he was 36 years old. We're super close. My wife's only sibling. We lived like a block away from his place. And he's here one moment and gone the next, and it just kind of like hit home how fragile life is. And I'm busy and bustling over here and creating all these commercials, but all of a sudden it was just like, what's the purpose of all this, right? I'm selling things over here, and I can make beautiful images and put together with music and to highlight a brand or a product. but ultimately, like, what's the point of that, right?
Mm.
And so, yeah, it was kind of like it was both grappling with the personal, what am I doing with my life? That life is really short. It's obviously extremely fragile. And then also, where's my brother-in-law? So those two kind of things kind of came together. And my wife and I, we started hearing stories of people who claimed to have died and had an experience and then came back. Actually, one of the first stories I heard was it wasn't in a book. It was somebody gave me, like, I think a CD of a bunch of different testimonies of people who, had these experiences. And there was one guy, Dr. Richard Ebby, I think his name was. And it was, to me, that was actually, to be honest with you, it spoke to me more than the books, because here I'm hearing a voice of someone who's actually describing what they saw. This guy was a doctor. He fell 2 stories, and his head split open, and he basically bled out. And what he's describing next was so detailed. And I couldn't get over, that his existence continued. It's
Mm.
not like it wasn't a fuzzy memory. It was just so, I never heard anything like this. It just gripped me in a way that nothing else had. And so I just wanted to know more. Who's this guy? Apparently he had passed away since, and then reading 30 some books, and then basically after a while I was just like, it's just a personal journey. I just wanted to, so I was seeking as a filmmaker, what kind of films are there out there on this topic, and it turns out there wasn't a lot,
Mm.
especially in 2012. This is before Heaven is for Real, came out with Sony Pictures, and there just wasn't a lot. And even when that film came out, to be honest with you, like Hollywood recreations of a story, where it's only a narrative, only didn't do too much for me in terms of help me along with that kind of grieving process. Because a Hollywood film, you can make something bigger than it is, and change a lot to the story. So for me as a filmmaker, I was just really interested in the individual stories, these real people, right? So, and I just wasn't finding anything out there like it, um, just to watch and consume for myself. And so that's where I kind of got the idea. I think it was around late 2016. Um, well, let's just go out and make it. There was something like, I think we had accumulated about 20 stories, and we started to reach out to some of these people, and it kind of gained their trust. And it's difficult for them to kind of explain their experiences and talk about their experiences in some cases, which I found interesting as well, kind of in the beginning process. A lot of them wrote their book as a kind of like a coping mechanism, so they wouldn't have to talk about it again. You write it down, and that's that.
Mm.
Unfortunately, it just creates more interest from people who want to hear more. So yeah.
Yeah, well, first, just thank you for sharing. I didn't know that. I didn't know the backstory on the why behind it. So I'm sorry for your loss and your wife's loss, and just the season that you guys have walked through. I mean, grief unfolds in seasons,
Yeah.
that, and people listening. It's just, I love Lewis on A Grief Observed, how he says death. I didn't know that death was so much like amputation. Like it just
Mhm.
is. It doesn't ever change, and you're conscious that you're missing a part of you. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry for the lost part, but I appreciate you as an artist. It makes sense now, right? Meeting you and hearing you tell the story, it makes sense, because before we got on, I was saying the music, particularly, like I was moved by the music throughout the piece, and it was an artistic piece, and it makes sense now from you as an artist. Art does that. It gives us a way and a venue and a vehicle to give language to things and ask questions and get near stuff that we couldn't get near with prose or with something else. So that makes a ton of sense. When you started the project, you kind of gave us an overview, but tell us just real quick, when you are sharing the story or first, and you say, we're going to make this movie, right? It's
Yeah.
going to be a documentary. It's going to be called After Death. And you, at the time, this was just your process. So you didn't know it was going to be debuted in theaters in the US and you'd be in LA premiering this. I mean, you
No
had no
clue.
idea that was coming. What
Mhm.
was your aim? You just said, I want to answer this question. I want to search these questions out. Did you know you were going to curate it through the voice of survivors and experts, and from both the medical side. Did you guys have that plan going in, or did it unfold?
Yeah, probably about 90% of it was planned. With the documentary, you want to definitely be open. I'm probably more of a planner than most in the field. So yeah, no, it was very intentional and mapped out in that way. And the whole idea of it was I was just interested in, what does the bigger picture look like? These individual stories are really interesting. And they did speak to me, but they're very, unique and specific to that person. And I was just kind of I was curious kind of on a bigger, grander level, what's really going on here. And I mean, I had in mind friends of mine after losing my brother-in-law who, as I'm kind of going through this process, they're just they're atheists and don't believe in anything. And I just found, like, talking to them about spiritual stuff, it was just like different language. It didn't mean anything to them. They're not picking up on anything. It's just immediately discounted, right? So I found these near death experiences actually begin to open the door, but more so the science behind it. Because the thing is, it's one thing for one person to kind of describe something they saw and experienced, which can be subjective. But it's another thing entirely when you have a whole field of doctors, cardiologists, neuroscientists, neurologists, surgeons who are encountering these things with patients. They're speaking from a place of authority from a medical perspective on sort of the process of death. And that's in some cases, which is what we really wanted to focus on in the film. I mean, there's some cases that are they're peer reviewed and studied, around the world today. And actually, in some science communities, there's new language that's being invented to try and get around the idea that there's a spirit world or a spirit realm, or that we aren't just our brains, and our minds are not just our brains. One of them being it's non-local consciousness is
Yeah.
a new word. And it's interesting to me because it's like, how do we explain these things where people are outside of their body at the moment when there's no brain activity, there's no heartbeat, there's no breathing, and they're hearing and seeing and experiencing things from outside of their body, different perspective, and in some cases even in different rooms from where their body was. So outside of their physical senses, and in some cases, like we have one case in the film, Pam Reynolds, where her brain is physically unable to create any new memory. It's non-functional because it's completely offline. There's no blood in the brain. So no oxygen, no blood, nothing going to the brain on purpose, because they're doing a really experimental surgery at the time, really risky, but it turned out okay on the lower part of her brainstem. But during that time is when she had the out-of-body experience. And she's relaying details of what happened during the surgery, including things that went wrong. I mean, we didn't get everything. We didn't go into everything in the film. You can only do so much in a documentary. But the thing I found interesting in that case too is she's talking about how she was really offended that the song they were playing in the operating theater was Hotel California. She thought it was just very insensitive because she was a little startled, and you're like, I'm going to be stuck here forever.
Mm.
And they're just having fun. And so when she's relaying this, the next day, and after getting, like, waking up, and after they stabilized her, the surgeon is really taken aback. They don't know what to do with this. First of all, it could be medical malpractice. If they didn't actually have records of that she was flatlined, like, this is dangerous. This is like legally dangerous and obviously physically dangerous. There's a reason why they're monitoring her brain activity the entire time, because her brain has to be flatlined during the entire procedure for
Wow.
them to do the operation successfully. And then sure enough, they go back and they read the transcripts, and no, it was flatlined that entire time. So there's no there's no other explanation for the experience that she had and how she can relay that detailed information. The other thing we have in the film is, we talk about blind near-death experiences. There was a study of 14 people who were blind from birth. People who are blind from birth, they don't have visual dreams. Something I didn't know before getting into this. So they only have audible dreams. So the brain actually doesn't have a way of creating like visual language. It doesn't know what that is. It actually does, and it's not just visual. It doesn't know what color is. Obviously, it doesn't know what light is, and it doesn't know what darkness is.
Hmm.
I'm pretty naive. I think I went into it thinking, it's like your eyes. If you couldn't see now, but you had all this visual experience, you would know that you can't see. But they obviously know that they're impaired, but they don't know what vision is. And there's this one lady, Vicky. She died in a car wreck, and her car was flipped upside down. And she relays visual descriptions of what happened after the crash. And then she followed, her body back to the hospital. She figures that must be her body because of the wedding ring and the length of her hair. Just kind of roughly, this has to be it, I guess. She's never seen herself. She doesn't know what that looks like. She doesn't know what vision is. She's having a visual experience in her near-death experience. And then she re-enters her body later, when she's told she has to go back. And again, her eyes don't work. She doesn't have working eyes. So, those are things that kind of are difficult to get around if you have a kind of a materialist worldview. And so that's what we wanted to do with the film, is kind of like crack open that door. Like let's go into some of the science and let's see how far we can push this and see where this goes, right? And so it's half story and half kind of science was kind of the idea for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Those stories are incredible. I mean, I'm grateful for a little bit of that backstory, because you'll only get so much in the film from these stories, but for you to sit with the doctors, sit with these survivors and have these conversations, that had to be remarkable. And it does challenge the assumptions of pretty much the modern age of, this hard materialist perspective. And wonderful Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has done a lot of work on the immanent frame. And I love the language that came out of Taylor's work, where people started saying that ceiling there's cracks in the ceiling, and transcendence is pouring through, and we're seeing light in the ceiling, which I love. That's kind of Shakespeare language too, that the floor of heaven has got gold, painted on it. So you're seeing people like Taylor, from another philosopher, saying there's something shifting, and people are saying we're post-secular, post-Christian now, at least in the West, in America. And that's when I saw the press release about this, I was interested because I like cool art projects and people doing new films. And I was like, oh, that's interesting as a documentary. But then it kind of jumped off the page to me, and I went, no, these guys are really doing a really important piece of journalism and work, kind of on the edge of modernity, so to speak, because there's a horizon there that we were told was wiped with Nietzsche and that materialist framework that said there is nothing. Yeah. And you're kind of standing on the edge saying, I think we all know that's not true.
Yeah.
But people are scared to talk about it. We don't know how to talk about it. And you're bringing these voices forward. Did you find people were reluctant to share their stories? Was it hard at first to get them to agree because of kind of the implications of what you're opening up?
Yeah, there was kind of layers to that. Some people who they don't have books and they haven't shared their story much before, in some cases not really at all. For them, it was more difficult, I would say, than others. But it's also a matter of, they have to, at the end of the day, trust me as a documentary filmmaker and really have to understand who I am and where I'm coming from, right? So I'm trying to remain objective in as best I can, unbiased in creating and telling these stories. I'm not trying to inject too much of my view on things, because really we're trying to make a film for everyone. And I know it might sound a little cliche, but I mean, death hits everyone. Death will affect literally everyone. Don says that the death rate here on Earth is 100%.
Yeah.
And I mean, like I said, it's for me in my story, it's just all rings all too true, right? Losing my brother-in-law just like causes me to realize how fragile life is. And so it's going to affect everyone. So we made the film for everyone. We don't make assumptions that people have a faith to come to the film. we hope that kind of everyone can come to the table and hear these stories and see the science and all that, and kind of draw a conclusion from there. But yeah, for the people opening up and sharing their story, they really need to know kind of where I'm coming from. So while I'm remaining, sort of unbiased, and the trajectory of the film is really for everyone, at the same time, I am a Christian. I'm an evangelical Christian. I'm very thankful that these stories, kind of help put me on a path, back to God, back to the Bible. And I'm just so passionate about these stories and what it can do for people, that I'm hoping that, these stories do the same as it did for me for others.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's kind of a bit of a mixed bag. There's a few people in the film that, they told their story a bunch of times, like Don Piper's one of them, John Burke as well. So, and John Burke didn't have near the experience, but he studied it for some 30 years. And someone like Don Piper, doing a bunch of television and radio interviews, and he comes from radio too, I should say. He came from radio before he was a pastor and before the near-death experience. So that's the background he has. So the challenge for me was for his story in particular, how do we get underneath those layers, right? How do we get to I'm interested in, what are the sound bites and what are the story that isn't so rehearsed, right? And actually, I came to find after, a bunch of these interviews that it's really difficult for them to go back to that moment.
Yeah.
Some of them rehearse what they're saying, like Dawn, for example, and Howard, another one too, because it's so they guard it. Like it's emotionally taxing beyond belief. I mean, they're in tears. It looks like, like they're a train wreck basically after an hour of trying to go here and actually get there, because they're recalling an experience that is unlike anything they've ever experienced here, right? Dawn would say, and Mary would say the same too. It's like they're experiencing this place where there is no death. There's no sin, there's no death, there's no grief. There's only hope, only joy, only love, only life. And we don't have that here on earth. It's just as it doesn't exist. We have both, the good and the bad. We have the light and the dark here.
Mm.
But there it's only light. And Mary says, in the film, it's like this is where she belongs. This is where we all belong. And they get a taste of that, and then they come back. So when they're recalling the experience, they actually go there for a moment. And that becomes a little bit depressing, the reality of being here.
Yeah. I love even just that idea of returning. It's the place we all belong. It's where we came from. And even just that idea of repentance being a return home. Sometimes in our mind, we think of it in moralistic, in a singularly moralistic way, but that idea of, no, you're coming home, you're returning home. There's an idea of there, you didn't come from nothing. And so there is a source to your life and an aim. That's what I love. I imagine you and your team, to go back to Taylor's imagery of those cracks in the immanent frame, kind of pulling down and uncovering like a beautiful dome that's been covered up and painted over, and we've just been told nothing exists above that. And then you go into that and buy that chapel or whatever, and somehow a piece falls down. You go, what is that? And then you and your team get in there and start uncovering that and breaking it apart. And pretty soon all of us are gathered around you looking up at the same thing. And I love that Lewis says, like, the best work you can do is to point and to look at something in such a way that people gather around, and when you leave, they're still looking. And I think that's what's going to happen with this. You could, because of the way that you did it. What's something that you uncovered when you were doing that work that maybe surprised you or impacted you particularly? And now knowing your story, was there a moment where you heard someone describe something, or, you've got a base foundation of biblical knowledge, you had an imagination, I'm sure, but was there something that surprised you or caused you to step back and be impacted in a particular way?
Honestly, almost everything that they described of what they experienced after they died was a surprise.
Hmm.
because they capture it in the book, and it is edited, like in terms of like making it sound a little better, a little better worded and all that kind of stuff, and we're getting the real raw data and information during the interview. And yeah, the things that they're describing of this world, it was so, yeah, it's like they all say there's no language here on Earth. There's no human language that exists that can begin to even try and describe what they saw and experienced. Not English, not any ancient language. It just doesn't exist here. They just all sense that it just never has existed.
Hmm.
And so that just like, well, we'll try, right? Um, and they all will admit that their words will be inadequate. What they're saying, how they describe it will be very inadequate. But that to me just kind of it spoke to me about like Paul he describes the going to the third heaven. Like he describes in the Bible about, we talked about this in the film too, that potentially, I don't know, we don't know for sure, but he may have had a near-death experience. Like he was stoned to death and left for dead. So the assumption is that they thought he was dead at least, or near death, right? And so and then he gets back up and goes in the city. But later he talks about a man that was caught up in the third heaven, and he saw things and heard things and that were inexpressible. Now in some translations, he talks about things that were unlawful to speak of. And I was, to be honest with you, that was actually one scripture that kind of caused me caution to even enter into this. I'm like, is this a world that I'm even allowed to go? Because it's like Christians don't go here,
Yeah.
And but then as I started to unpack some of the original language too, it's like I was finding it seems to be that it's pointing to, it's unlawful in that there's no, in the law there's no no reference point. Like there's things that he's seeing and experiencing that there is no reference point. So how do we speak of this? He can't.
Yeah.
And honestly, that perfectly aligns to what these people all describe of what they experience. As best they can, they're trying to describe, but they're gonna fall short in every way. But some of the things that they do try and say is, when they die, whether they had a good experience or bad experience, they all step into what they call eternity. So they step into this existence of eternity, which yeah, I didn't really know much of what to make of it before this film. But they're talking about, this is tangibly a different dimension. So time doesn't exist here. It's not that time stops. It just doesn't exist here. So it's a completely different dimension. The interesting thing I found too is all of them describe that their experience was not linear. So they tell it in a linear fashion so that I can try and make sense of it. Same as their book, and everyone else is going to watch the film, tell in a linear way. But Mary would say her experience from the moment when she drowned, she was 30 minutes underwater, to yeah, to this experience was just, this existed. It wasn't in a linear order. It just all was. So beginning, middle, and end just didn't exist. It wasn't this to this to this. It just was. So she all at the same time, she's seeing her body, she floating down the river after broken bones, and freed her from the pinned kayak downstream, and hit someone's leg, and they're doing a body recovery, and her friends who are actually professional kayakers try and perform CPR simply because it's their friend and they want her back, not because it really made sense, because it's way past the point of that effort beginning. And she sees that whole endeavor also while getting a taste of heaven at the same time. And it doesn't, that doesn't make a lot of sense in my brain, but it was really interesting to kind of hear that similarity across all of these different experiences. I mean, we interviewed people from different cultures, different backgrounds. That was something that later during production, the producers Jensen, Jason, and I, and Chris, we talked about, if this is happening in North America, if we have, let's say, a materialist worldview, and we're trying to write off all near-death experiences. Never mind the Pam Reynolds, never mind blind near-death experiences. Let's just ignore those. And all the other ones, we can just kind of say, well, they're having an hallucination, which is deriving from everything that their brain is being subjected to during the course of their life, right? So TV shows, movies, whatever it is. At some point, maybe they saw Jesus, and so they're going to maybe see Jesus in North America after they die. That would be the kind of argument I would hear. And so, but we were curious too, like what do other people experience outside of the Western cultures? So we actually sought out and interviewed a variety of people, and found evidential cases of people who had died, because that was really important for us, was to find stories that just weren't just stories on their own, but actually had eyewitnesses or doctors or people that were declaring them dead, so that we had something to go off of, right? Not just hearsay. And those stories in other cultures and religions and backgrounds, we were finding a lot of overlap, a lot. And the interesting thing for me, I think the most interesting, was that a lot of people's experiences were counter to what they grew up, being taught. So, there was a gentleman, and the first, I think, person that we talked to was out in India. It was a city in India, and he's a doctor himself. Actually, later became a doctor, but when he was a kid, he was electrocuted. He accidentally grabbed a live wires on the ground, and his dad actually went to go and help him, and actually got electrocuted as well. And the mom was freaking out. He had an out of body experience. He's floating up above, and he's seeing the whole thing happen, and he's seeing his dad go to him and try and help him and get electrocuted. And he's seeing the roof, and he's going above the building, and he's seeing details on the roof and around the cities. He can see kind of details far away and details close all at the same time. So he doesn't need to look far and focus. Focus is infinite, but also macro all at the same time, which is, very unusual. But when he stepped into this place, it was like, I'm still in the world today. I'm still in the world here, but I've kind of stepped into, eternity. Or yeah. So he would have a different word for it, but it would be, in description, it would be similar to what people would describe as eternity, in that, this is a different, this is a different set of rules, or is something else here. And it's not necessarily the world that applies to this. This exists in the world and around it, but it's a different set of rules. And so, but what he had experienced, the little bit that he experienced, because he quickly went back into his body after that, just snapped back, was what he experienced was very counter to what he was raised to believe in that city that he grew up in. So, and then that actually created conflict with his family. So he was actually reluctant to even talk about it, because, he doesn't want to risk, not having his family around, right? In some cultures, family is, way more important than North America, and you wouldn't want to risk that. And even in some countries and societies, it's the things that people are describing, like in Iran, for example. You can get in a lot of trouble, and coming forward and talking about the things that are very counter to what your culture and your religion is supposed to be. So, but we were finding a lot of overlap between different people, So so the story of Steve King in our film, we found his story, and he's a guy he was born in South Korea. And so when he grew up in South Korea, before he did eventually move to the United States, but when he was raised in South Korea, he was raised in a Buddhist home. His family is very serious about, bringing him to the temple and getting, taught by the monks there. And in that culture, in that era in South Korea, there's no televisions in homes. There's no movie theaters. They're completely insulated from Western culture. It's thought to be like a infiltration if there was, let's say, there's no preachers like on the street, there's no Bibles accessible. So he's not getting any of that from the Western culture. Later, when he had a near-death experience, it actually perfectly aligned with some of the other people we interviewed, including Howard, where he actually had a hellish near-death experience, but then eventually God basically had reached out and told him, "I love you, Steve," and actually, we don't go into all of the events that take place in the film because it's just a little too much. We wanted to save space for Howard's story. It's pretty close to when that happens in the film, but to unpack Steve's story a little bit, he hears this voice and he doesn't know what this voice is. He just knows this is the creator. This is a voice that's much more beyond myself, or it's not coming from me. It's coming from outside, and it's a commanding voice. And the voice just said, "I love you, Steve. No more drugs. No more Buddhism."
Hmm.
And he wakes up in a hospital. And the crazy thing to his story is, when he woke up in the hospital, and we'll get into the detail of it, save it for the film, but he basically he lost a lot of blood and eventually went into slipped into unconsciousness. And when he woke up though in the hospital room after they barely kind of got him stabilized, there just so happened to be a bunch of pastors that just showed up. There's a few of them in that group that felt compelled to, for whatever reason, go to this hospital on this day in this room, and there's going to be someone there to pray for.
Wow.
And I guess this was regular for them, and they would go to the hospital, but it was just so specific on this day at this time. And he comes to, and among after the nurses and his mom is crying and had a little bit of time, they approach him and just ask, do you want to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior? He right away he said he prayed to accept Jesus 10 times just to be sure. He was so excited. It was the most exciting thing he's ever, like, it was the most exciting thing of his entire life was that moment. But I found it interesting too is that the timing of things is so specific, and that's not just Steve's story. That's so many other stories. I mean, Don's story is that. Don's story, he's run over by an 18-wheeler truck. And it just so happened to be that someone that was at a conference that he attended, that he was going home from on that day, was going to happily traveling that same bridge. This is a different route he's never taken before, only on that day. And he happens to go on that day. And there's someone else traveling, Dick and Anita Honorecker. Anita is in the film, her late husband had passed away, but she's kind of recalling from her experience, what she saw. She's an eyewitness to the crash before, the paramedics had arrived and all that. This is before cell phones. So she had to go to a payphone to try to even call people. And so there's a state trooper that comes in and he's being actually told to treat this as a crime because we've got a fatality. There's a man, after they checked him with 4 EMTs, that he's there's no pulse. And so while that's all happening, Anita's husband, Dick, he's told via a voice very clearly, go and pray for that man. And he hesitates at first. I can't remember how many times it was. I don't know if it's once or twice or whatever it was. After that, he hears the voice again. And eventually he just, okay, I'll go pray for that man. He's dead, So he goes and checks just to be sure and feels for a pulse, doesn't find a pulse, and just kind of obediently prays. And he prays a very specific prayer. He prays that, this is what was impressed upon him: one, that the man would not have internal injury, and that the man would live. So Don was, his head was crushed in, his arm was like disjointed, his leg was severed. So he was in really rough shape, and there was no pulse. So for him to survive that, is no one thought it was going to happen, right? So eventually, after prayer, he comes to, and so then Dick tries to kind of keep his vitals, and he's talking to him and asking him his name and where he's from and things. Like, he just knew we got to keep him
With us,
here with us and awake. And then they had to bring the jaws of life, and it was a whole ordeal because they actually had called the coroner to come pick up his body. There was no emergency situation. So at that point they had to switch into emergency situation. But it's interesting to me that had to be so specific for that to happen on that day. that almost like God knew that that man would respond to that calling and go and pray at that time, right? Same for Steve's story. I mean, Howard's story, we didn't get this into this in the film, but he, he has a hellish near-death experience. He then in that he sees himself as a child, and he was brought to Sunday school, I think once or twice when he was a kid. That was it. And that's his only, religious experience. He has nothing else to go off of. He lived his entire life as a staunch atheist. And in this memory he has as a child, he's being shown, a very simple song, "Jesus loves me, this I know." And he's told via voice to pray. He doesn't have any words. He doesn't know what that means. So he just kind of, I can't do it. Then he's told again insistently, pray. Third time is very insistently, pray, almost like aggressively, as he describes it. And then he says, he didn't know what words to say. He just starts saying things like, "God bless America," just whatever kind of came to mind, reciting certain things of, from American literature. And then, sure enough, he was noticing that these beings that were around him that were attacking him were pushed off. Eventually he calls out to Jesus to save him in this place. Jesus comes and pulls him up out of this place. And, he immediately thinks that this is a mistake. He calls this place that he was in, the universe's garbage dump, essentially. This is the trash bin for the universe. And this didn't feel like a mistake. This felt very much, he knew that this is what he chose. And he was, he wasn't okay with it, but this is his decision. And so when this happened and Jesus rescued him out of that, he didn't feel that he's worthy of that. That doesn't make any sense. And so he's thinking these thoughts. Jesus stops, looks to him and says, you do belong here, which they're going towards heaven. And he says, we don't make mistakes. You do belong here. And the interesting thing about timing was when he came back, he doesn't have any religious friends. He doesn't have any connections with the church. He doesn't know what even that is. He didn't become a Christian at first either. He doesn't even know what that is. And so, but a few weeks later, eventually the first person he could think of was this lady that he met, years and years ago in the university. He recontacts her. She ended up that she became a nun. And he tells her the story and asks if she believes it. And she just says, "Of course I believe it. I'm just kind of wondering why it took so long." And he was just confused, like, what do you mean? And she says, "Howard, I've been praying for you every day for 13 years.
Wow.
And then when she became a nun, she got all the sisters also praying for him. And he's not the only one she prays for. She's a prayer warrior. She prays for a ton of people. And she just consistently prayed every day for 13 years. And then he had this, experience, turns his life around. He goes from atheist, university professor, to a pastor. 90% pay cut, almost completely voluntary during his entire career to this day. So that to me that kind of spoke to, he had a lot to lose in telling a story, not just telling a story, but also living it, right? A lot of these people, they're living their story. Like, why would you choose to change your life around that drastically if this wasn't real?
Listening to you go through these stories and give some of the backstories, even about just the time perspective of eternity. And there's so much, some people say, well, Christians can't think about this because, it's going beyond, what we have in Scripture. And I would say with thanks for bringing Paul's description of the third heaven. I think it's actually, there's way more in Scripture that allows us to have cosmology and even a picture of eternity and time and what's time bound and not time bound. That's actually way more biblical in alignment than some of the imagination that we have culturally from a really divided sphere. Like, here we are and there we are, So your work is so important on so many levels. I think of Francis Schaeffer, the fog of materialism creeps in through an open window, even in the church. And I think about like the moments you and your team probably had, listening to these stories or just sitting around digesting, like, what did we just hear? And then we hear it again, and then we hear it again. And I imagine I would love to just get dinner sometime and hear some of those stories, because here's what I'm imagining is you as a person who worships God in a church. And I bet, there's a malaise that Taylor talks about too, a numbness that's kind of settled
Right.
in, and spiritual acedia, the sloth. We're just kind of slumbering along. And I think the other thing that this hope comes downstream of this film is that when we worship, we who do believe and we know Jesus and we worship this God of eternity and that created us all, that there's a bit more wonder and a bit more just realization that we're not just cold, ghosts in the machine standing here hoping that maybe somewhere, some far out place, God's there. Did it impact the way that you worship?
Oh, 100%. Like it transformed my life. It didn't just put me back on course to becoming, firmly with my faith as a Christian. But honestly, like I don't think I've ever read the Bible as intentionally and as deeply as I do now. I read it very differently and like just so intentionally, because it's just like this is real. I mean, it comes alive in a different way.
Yeah.
I have even more reverence for it. I have more reverence for God, and like you say, with worship, music and worship is something that I don't know, it goes right to the heart, and I think that's a connection to God. That's a kind of God's language. It kind of puts us into that. I don't know. There's just something different with worship, and that's what we did also with the music. I was just going to say, the music in the film was kind of was an expression of that. So the challenge with making this film is, and especially the budget we had, is you can only do so much, and we're never gonna we're never gonna get close, as these people are can't find words to describe what they're seeing and experiencing. We're not going to be able to get even close, even with unlimited budget, to the visuals of what they saw. So we took an artistic approach. We kept it cosmic, and that's really intentional to kind of to inspire and evoke things that this is real. So just the same with these stories seem to point to a reality of a spiritual realm. We can look to the cosmos, and we can look to galaxies and universes and stuff, and it can give us a sense of wonder. And we try to bring that into the film because this is God's creation the same way. But one thing we did attempt was sonically, we felt like that's probably the closest we can get to heaven. And so I mean, we tried.
Yeah.
And Hannah Parrott, she is an unbelievable composer. She worked under amazing composers, and she's just incredible. But she was able to pick up on, and also her story, she had gone through loss and was beginning to ask questions years ago, which aligned with my why with the film and the purpose with the film and what we were doing and all that. She was on board with what we were doing. But fortunately, she made the attempt and went to places that we never dreamed. And so sonically, we're attempting to get there with a score, and we're moving through all kinds of levels, including there's hellish near experiences, there's heaven experiences, there's loss, there's grief, there's hope, there's everything about life, and the hope that we have after is wrapped up sonically. And then the same thing with sound design too. I mean, we worked with an incredible sound design team at Outpost out in St. Louis, who were also the editors of the film. And I feel like sonically, again, with sound design and the music, we're able to get close and move us at least emotionally, right? And that stuff can speak to the heart, and the science and the medical kind of speak to the mind.
Yeah. Yeah, you did both really, really well, and the music stood out. And I'm with you. I think that you've got poetry, and you've got music, and you've got whatever is beyond music. And it is the music of the spheres. It is touching. So I think your choice to use music or as the closest thing was the right one. Hey, I could keep talking to you for weeks, but you're going to have to get on a jet and go to LA, which I'm super excited for. The work that you guys did, is just really wonderful. I think it's really important when you think about 100% of us are facing this, what is next? And I think it's obviously it's the most important question any of us can face and wrestle through, but we avoid it. We don't want to think about it.
Right.
And so I think you allow us as artists do to look at something that's weighty, and you take us there in a really beautiful, elegant way, and you do it really faithfully. So man, as an artist and as a person of faith, and a person who's been through grief and loss, like the time that you gave us today to see you as that person just inspires me to say, go see the film, share it. It comes out October 27th. It'll be
That's
in
right.
Canada and the US. And so Angel Studios, you partnered with them. They're going to make it available and platform it. So good job to them to pick up another piece of good art.
Yeah.
And Stephen, we're going to be excited to see how this rolls out and keep the conversation going. But I just want to personally say I've enjoyed this, like your humility and your artistry and some of the choices you made. There's a ton of depth behind you that I just pick up on. And there's a really beautiful, humble spirit about what you've done. So thanks for your work. We're cheering you on. Have fun on all those trips and stay healthy. But congratulations. What a beautiful project. And everybody go check it out. After Death, coming out October 27th. Stephen, thank you.
Thank you so much.